My name's Sue Newby. I'm the learning officer here at the Brontë Museum. I've worked here for quite some time now. I just describe myself. I'm a woman in her later years. I've got short, kind of grey, white hair. I'm wearing a grey jumper. It all sounds a bit grey, doesn't it? And I'm wearing glasses. And I'm going to talk to you today about the Brontes, putting it in a little bit of context with the museum as it is now. I thought it might be quite nice to describe and show you what you would see if you came on a visit today. Not exactly today, because the pictures I'm using were taken in that gorgeous spell of sunshine we had in June. So they all look very, very sunny and lovely. And I'll tell you, it doesn't look like that around here very much at all. It's usually quite grey and gloomy, but kind of atmospheric. Anyway, let's start off, first of all, with the girls, the three sisters, what it's all about, really. So this is an image. I don't know whether any of you have seen it before. It's an oil painting of three girls. They're actually in the teens. It's a bit hard to tell because of the style. They look quite gloomy. They're in 19th century clothes. They look kind of similar. None of them look particularly attractive. The picture is a portrait that was painted by the brother Branwell. Branwell was kind of the black sheep of the family. He was the only boy. Originally, there was five girls, and there was Branwell. They were all talented in so many ways. They were all talented visual artists. But Branwell, being the only boy, got a chance to try and have a stab at having a career as a painter. So he painted this picture of his siblings when he was still kind of practicing. Now, this is actually in the National Portrait Gallery in London. It's a really important picture because it's the only one we've got these three sisters anywhere. So Charlotte on the right, Emily, we think, in the middle and on the left, although we're not completely certain about those two. It's a strange image because in the middle, there's a kind of an image, a ghostly image of somebody who you can't make out properly. And that is actually the brother. And he included himself in the image to start off with, changed his mind, painted a pillar over himself, used the wrong paint. In time, that faded, and we've got this strange kind of ghostly image. There's a lot of kind of myths about the Brontes, and one of them is that Branwell painted himself out of this picture because he felt so guilty, so full of kind of self-hatred, because he was an addict, because he was a drug addict, he was an alcoholic. His talent never really came to anything. But that isn't true. That isn't why that happened. It's just a more interesting story. There are also fold marks down the middle and across. And this is because Charlotte's husband, after she died, folded the picture up, shoved it at the top of a wardrobe because he didn't think it looked like any of them. And people sometimes say, why haven't you restored the picture so you can't see the fold marks? But it's part of the history. It's part of the story of the picture. It's part of kind of what goes with the whole strange Bronte story. I don't know if any of you've read anything by the Brontes, but Charlotte on the right there, her most famous novel, of course, is Jane Eyre. A really groundbreaking novel at the time, partly because it was such a passionate story. Some people disapproved, but it's also the story of a girl's journey into independence, the things she has to overcome. For the time, she is an extremely independent woman who makes her own decisions, goes her own way, and it's just a brilliantly written book. It's a great story. She wrote three other novels, The Professor, Shirley, and Villette. None of them quite have had the same impact as Jane Eyre. Emily, if that is Emily in the middle, was a great poet. They all wrote poetry, but she was by far the best poet. And her one famous novel was Wuthering Heights. An amazing, strange book. It's really hard to put it into any kind of category. If any of you have read it, you might kind of get that. It's in some ways, it's quite dark, very passionate, very much about nature, with a heroine who is incredibly headstrong, willful, at times even quite violent, not how women were supposed to be at the time. But again, a truly brilliant story. Anne on the left there has often been a bit overlooked. She wrote 2 novels, but her great one is The Tenant of Wildfell Hall, which is the most kind of, it's the most feminist of all the Brontë books, really. So they were all born here. Well, Charlotte was born in 1816, Emily 1818 and 1819. And they died when they were very young. Charlotte was 38, Emily was 30, and Anne was 29. So the older I get, the more tragically, ridiculously young they were when they died. And you think, what might they have achieved if they'd lived longer? But there you go. So the Brontes, we'll come back to them in a minute. So they were brought up they lived in West Yorkshire. I don't know if any of you have ever visited West Yorkshire, but it's a kind of it's amazing contrast. It's a very wild kind of landscape. So here's an image of the moorland, which is quite close to here. So you've only got to walk literally 10 minutes and you're up on the moors. Absolutely at the heart of Wuthering Heights. There's a moorland setting in every Brontë novel. It's where they love to be more than anything else. And still now, you have great expanses of this beautiful wild landscape, but it's also quite an industrial landscape, and it was in the Brontes' day. I mean, apart from the fact in West Yorkshire, we've got Bradford, which is only 9 miles from here, Leeds, Halifax, even in the smaller towns and villages like Haworth, where the Brontes grew up. There were ruins now all around of old mills from that time. The earliest mills were water powered. So these little villages in the Pennines were perfect places to site a mill. You got the fast flowing water coming down from the hills. And also there was a tradition of the woolen textile industry. So you've got that great contrast. And while the Brontes were here as well, there was massive changes going on. From, the hand textile industry to mechanized. This is one of the earliest images of Haworth, and you can see my arrow there, but that is what a steam powered mill. You've got the chimney there. And you get a sense of a very crowded kind of place. Those rows of houses and buildings you can see it still kind of describe the structure of Haworth now. Very crowded, and then you just got a little walk and you're up in the hills. So this is where the Brontes lived their lives. This is where they grew up. They didn't choose to write about the Industrial Revolution. They chose to write about other things, about more personal relationships, but all the changes kind of find their way in anyway, in peculiar ways. Main Street, which is as it describes, the main street of Haworth, it's just 2 minutes from here. This on the right, there's an image of it as kind of as it is today. So you've got a steep cobbled street. You've got buildings, it's a narrow street. You've got buildings on either side. You've got little signs that say Yoldi Brontë Tea Rooms, a gift shop, a restaurant called Stirrup, and there's bunting across the street. So it gives us, and in the distance, you can see the valley goes down very steeply and rises again in the distance, and you can see that. So it looks like a place you'd like to come for a day out, a nice little visit, and lots of people do. It's quite quaint. There's lots and lots of, like I say, tea shops, gift shops, the parsonage, the moors. There's even a steam railway station at the bottom of the village. The image on the left, and if you can see it, you can actually see that it's the same part of the street. But this was taken over 100 years ago. We recognise it today, the Brontes would recognise it. So you can see the steps on the right, the two in both images, the structure, kind of the street. In the middle of this, though, is a man with a horse and cart. But you get a little bit of a sense of it not being this kind of charming touristy place, but somewhere that was quite dirty, quite poor, quite workaday, which it was. A lot of poverty in Haworth in the Brontes' time, a very high death rate. Strangely, tragically, Haworth had a death rate that was very similar to places in London, to some of the worst, unhealthiest places in the countryside. It had an infant mortality. Nearly half the children born in Haworth didn't reach their 6th birthday. It's just extraordinary. And you have to think, why is this? Because it does seem quite a nice place. But though basically you had more and more people coming to live in house, and there was no sewage system to cope with it. So that was a big problem. It was the dirty water they were drinking. Patrick, the Bronte's father, who I'll mention in a minute, was a great campaigner to try and improve conditions in Haworth. But basically, it was quite a poor, in some ways, quite a squalid place. Okay. So now I'm going to move on to the museum as it is today and just give you some like little impressions of what it might be like if you come to visit today. So just to say, the museum is actually the parsonage that the family lived in. They came here in 1820 because the father got the job as the vicar. More about him later. So the museum is actually the parsonage that they lived in. So just to explain that. So what you can see here is just different images that kind of show what you might see when you come on a visit today. So the top left hand, you can see part of the actual parsonage from the cobbled street at the side, the trees in full leaf, the sun shining. To the right of that, we've got two visitors stood in the garden looking out at the church where Patrick preached. What you don't see is what is in between, which is a lot of gravestones. The garden is a little bit more planted and pretty than it would have been in the Brontes' time. They weren't great gardeners. On the left, you can just see some visitors coming in to the garden to go into the museum. And then on the right at the bottom, we have the parsonage itself. So it's not a big building, but it's deliberately designed to look quite imposing. You were the Church of England ministers, locals had to look up to you, so you were given quite a nice house to live in. The Brontes could never have bought a house like this. They were not a rich family at all. Most vicars were younger sons, gentlemen, they had a bit of money of their own. Patrick didn't. So this house came with the job. There's an extension on the right-hand side called the gable end extension. That wasn't there in the Brontes' time. That was built afterwards by a vicar with a bit more money. This is what it looked like in the Brontes' day. So you can see on the left, it all looks a bit bleaker, doesn't it? You can tell from the clothes that people are wearing that this is a 19th century image, kind of mid-19th century, and it's looking out at the parsonage from a kind of side angle. And you can see the gravestones and things that actually surrounded the parsonage. And there, in the bottom right-hand corner, this is as they would have known it, looking at it from the front. So you've got quite an imposing doorway, kind of classically designed, 2 windows on either side, an upper floor with 5 windows. It was less built up around the parsonage then, so you get the sense of it being right on the edge of the moors. That picture in the left-hand corner was taken in 1855, we think. So Charlotte Brontë, in theory, could have been in the building when that was taken, but none of the others because they died by then. So it's not even as big on the inside as it looks like on the outside. It wasn't luxurious living, but compared with many people in Haworth, the Brontes were privileged, but they certainly weren't wealthy. Okay, so we got next. Churchyard, there's one guy, looks like he's wearing a white coat, and he is chiseling a name in a headstone. The sound of the chisel of the stonemason putting another name on the headstone was a sound that you heard in the parsonage and roundabout all the time, and the tolling of the funeral bell. Now you'll see in this picture there are no trees, and that is quite interesting because there wouldn't have been trees around at the time, and they were planted deliberately by the recommendations of an inspector who said the other problem that's facing the population of Haworth, it's not just sewage getting into the drinking water. Because this churchyard is so overcrowded, when rain falls, it travels through the churchyard, and it's going down into the water supply where people are pumping water to drink. So it's been polluted by the bodies in the churchyard as well, which is about as bleak, isn't it, really, a prospect as you could do. So this is the reality of where the British were. in some ways they were quite cushioned from this. In other ways, they wouldn't have been at all. They certainly had a, a, a connection with the harsh realities of life and with people who were really, in many ways, not exactly brutal, but called a spade, had to survive in difficult conditions. And this does influence the writing. One of the criticisms people said about the writing, and especially Wuthering Heights, is it's full of brutal. It's too dark. It's not refined enough. But you know, the Brontes, this is the world that they were a part of. Okay. So let's imagine that you're going on a visit to the museum, you bought your ticket, and you go through the door. Now, one of the first, so we have the museum set out as much as possible as we think it would have been when the Brontes lived in it. So there are some places, parts of the museum where it's more traditional exhibition, you see things displayed. And then, but where we can, we try to create a sense of life in the house as it would have been. Everything you see, or almost everything you see when you look round, is artifacts, furniture, manuscripts, books that belong to them. So we're not showing you the kind of thing we think they would have had. We're showing you their possessions, which is, which is brilliant. So what you can see here, when I looked at this picture, I thought, this isn't how this room looks. It's much too bright and sunny. And the reason is, normally we have blinds down on those windows that you can see. You look in the picture on the left. So we're seeing quite a sunny room with a table in the centre, some chairs, some red curtains, a couple of pictures on the wall, and books on the shelves. On the top picture, on the right-hand corner, it's the same image, but you can also see a sofa. So all these things are original. The sofa is the sofa that Emily died on. So this is the table is the table that we're fairly sure we did a lot of the writing that she would have written Wuthering Heights. If anybody's interested in how we this is a whole talk in itself, but how we actually acquire the collection, because the Bronte Society started out with very, very little. It's been a long process of bringing things back to the parsonage. And this table was owned by a family in Surrey until about 10 years ago. And we eventually managed to buy it off them. They looked after it very well, but now it's kind of back home where it should be, really. Yes, so what I was saying about the blinds, it's very sunny. The room's very sunny, but the blinds are up, so we don't normally see it as sunny as it would be sometimes. This is an image. So this is a room. It was the dining room, but it was also the living room. So you see what I mean? It's not a very commodiously appointed house in a sense. Big family and not a lot of living space. So they would sit here together. They'd talk. There's a story of in later life, Charlotte, Emily and Anne would walk round and round the table at the end of the day. The father would go to bed. The girls would walk around the table and they'd talk about their ideas that they had for their latest writing. They would, as all young women, they would spend quite a lot of time sewing. They had an aunt who lived with them who made sure that they did. And this is one of the sewing boxes. This is original. You can see the little illustration there in the lid. You can see the beautiful little scissors there that actually looks like a heron. So they each have their own sewing box and spend quite a lot of time doing that. I always imagine they wouldn't have particularly wanted to when they were younger. They'd rather be running around on the moors or writing the stories. But as girls, that's what they had to do. This is Patrick's study. So he had a room to himself. The piano there that you can see, we've got two images here. The one on the right shows a very funny old-fashioned looking piano called a cottage piano. But Patrick bought this, and that would have been quite an outlay for him. He only had £200 a year, which wasn't much even then. So this was for the children to learn to play the piano, and they all did skillfully, except Charlotte, who was too short-sighted. This is a room where Patrick would teach his children. So they were largely self-taught. Sorry, largely taught at home, apart from a really awful experience that they had when they were sent away to school for a few months. On the right, we can see a newspaper with a magnifying glass. Patrick was very short-sighted. He actually had he was probably one of the first people who had a cataract operation. Charlotte took him to Manchester. It was done there. This is a time when there's no anaesthetic. As far as we know, he didn't get an infection, which is amazing. So anyway, it worked, but he was very short-sighted. Um, and that magnifying glass is something that he would use as well as glasses. But you can see how dense the magnifying glass is on a newspaper with extremely dense, close text. There's an article there that says John Bull. The Brontes didn't, growing up, had very few books, children's books to read. There weren't many children's books at this time, and those that were not designed to be fun or entertaining. The Brontes loved stories, and they would get them from wherever they could. They would get them from the Bible, they'd get them from Shakespeare, they'd get them from journals and newspapers. So you can't imagine really today, like a 7-year-old reading that. I've got a 9-year-old granddaughter who I got not in a million years could I imagine her reading that. But they did. They weren't used to a culture where they constantly had images and entertainment, so they would get the stories where they could. The next one is the kitchen. So we have a door leading. So we've seen here quite a small room. There's a range in the centre of it, which of course they would cook on. There's a table. The range isn't original. For some reason, the one that was there in the Bronte's day was taken out, but we've got one from the period in. The table has scales, a ladle, a mixing bowl, all things that belong to the Bronte. We have a door that leads from it that wouldn't have been there then. There's a cabinet with a kind of a glass fronted window. That would have been an actual window that I would have looked onto outside. So there would have been a back kitchen where they'd have done laundry and got the water from and done the dirty jobs. So this was just really preparing food. The Brontes always had a servant. This wasn't the kind of servant who would wait on you with a little white pinny and come at the ring of a bell. This was somebody who would help with the real hard, heavy work that would be involved in running a household like this. And the Brontes helped out with children. The girls certainly would have helped with the various jobs. The most well-known, the most familiar of the servants was someone called Tabby. And she was a great favourite with the children. She was here when they were quite young. She was full of stories, very down to earth, very warm, knew what the gossip in the village. And the Brontes kind of kept themselves a little bit separate, so they kind of knew what was going on through her. But we've got a lovely story of the Brontes as children sat in this room, and it's bed. Charlotte tells us what happened, and she said it was bedtime. Tabby was trying to get them to go to bed. This would have been a warm room, so you can, they're literally warm and in every sense. So they'd sit here with Tabby, and one day she said, "Go to bed," and Charlotte, they were playing for time like children do. And she said, "Imagine we each had an island." And they all said, "Well, I'd have the Isle of Man, I'd have the Isle of Wight, I'd have Arran, I'd have Guernsey." And they imagined this island and who would be in charge of it, what it would be like. And then they had to go to bed because the clock struck 7. But this was the beginning of stories the children made up called the Tales of the Islanders. And the Brontes made up imaginary worlds around a set of toy soldiers the father brought home one day. And this was one of the ways that it began. And it was literally a way of just entertaining themselves and having fun. But it was the beginning of their careers as writers. I'll just show you this slide. So these are the scales. And there's a book open there, and it's a book of German grammar. And we know that Emily was the greatest homebody of them. She hated leaving Haworth. She had to go for a while to work as a teacher, but she really hated it. So she'd do a lot of the job. She'd bake the bread and so on. And apparently she taught herself German while she was in the kitchen making the bread. And that's her German grammar propped up on the set of scales there. I'll give you a little bit more of the story of you know, of their lives in a little while. I'm just trying to give you a sense of the museum and their home really, and as you see it today. So we go from downstairs up the stairway. It looks quite imposing, a nice tall window with a rounded arch. On the right, in a little alcove, is a grandfather clock. And that is a clock that we think that's original. It was actually made in Haworth. And on the left is the Brontë portrait, but that I showed you before, but it is a copy, and the original is in, like I say, the National Portrait Gallery. We've just got a new copy actually with better quality colour. Just show you one room we have upstairs, which is called the children's study. Now you can see it's very small. It's the bedroom. Who slept where in this parsonage is kind of quite difficult to figure out. There were 4 bedrooms that were used by the family. They would have been used by different people at different times, but this certainly would have had Charlotte and Emily sleeping in here at one time. So you can see the window there. They would also have used it as their study. We've got a little image underneath the main one that shows the room as a whole, and this shows a little wooden soldier. So this represents, we don't have any of the original wooden soldiers, but the father brought a set home for Bramwell one day. Came in, a bit spoiled, I think, being the only boy, came in to his sisters, showing his new toys. They all took one each, and this was another start of stories. It was based on the adventures of these toy soldiers. On the right, you can just about see an image of a profile. It's quite faded, but this was discovered on the wall of this room. And the story is, we don't know if it's true, but I think on balance we think it is, that probably the room is about to be repainted, and the Brontes drew faces on it. And I remember doing that as a child before decoration drawing on the walls. And we think that's what that image probably is on the right. So it's quite faint, but it's kind of quite exciting to see. Some certain things give you a real sense of connection with them as they were living in the house. And for some reason, that's one of them that does it for me. Another room we have in here is Patrick's bedroom. This is quite interesting. So you can see quite a grand bed here. It's a kind of half 4-poster. It's got a little canopy over it. Now that isn't the original bed, but we have a picture by Branwell. I should have put that up. It's a kind of a horrible cartoon he drew just before he died. So he's in bed. A skeleton, which represents death, is trying to get him to fight. And Branwell's saying, I can't fight you anymore. So this is just before he died. But he's shown lying in a bed with that we've based this bed on. We've recreated it based on his cartoon, because we know in his final months he had to share a bed with his father because he couldn't be trusted not to set fire to the place, because he did actually start a fire at one point. So this is quite a nice room. There's a fireplace in it, a small fireplace. There's 3 paintings on the wall, which you can't see very well, but they were portraits by Branwell. He did try to earn his living as a painter, not very successfully, but he lived in Bradford. Actually, these portraits, I think, are really, really good. There's a nice painted chest of drawers there. So it all suggests a kind of quite a simple life. I mean, generally people didn't have a lot of possessions anyway, but any visitors that came to the house said it was always very neat and tidy, and something kind of quite attractive about it, really. So this is what I've shown you there is what you see when you visit the museum today. So it's our idea of the rooms. We've used what we've got, furniture. It's inevitably that it would be unsanitary. It would have felt more lived in. But we're trying to give people as real and vivid a sense as we can. So what I'm going to do now is tell you a bit more detail about the Brontë story. Is everything okay so far? Yeah. Okay, so I'm just going to show you here this is an image of Patrick Brontë. We don't quite know when it was taken. Painted, sorry. It's quite small. We've got it in the museum at the moment. He looks to me like he was kind of in his late 20s. He's got a book in his hand. It might have been not long after he graduated. Now, the picture on the right is of basically a hovel. It's a drawing, an illustration of a kind of cottage that's just broken down, and it says Patrick Bronte's birthday. So Patrick was born into a two-room labourer's cabin. It did have a roof on it when he lived in it, when he was born there, but he was the eldest of 10 children, and he was born into a poor family. So how did he end up going to Cambridge University and becoming a Church of England minister? He seemed to be extraordinary, really, Patrick, very bright. He was noticed by people who helped him, basically. He worked in a local school for a while, and then with the support of various people, he went to St John's College in Cambridge, with the idea of becoming a Church of England minister on the kind of evangelical side. So they were all about getting out there preaching, quite passionate about their faith, quite strong opinions about things like very anti-slavery. So he was sponsored. One of his sponsors was William Wilberforce, who's actually the great, anti-slavery campaigner. So he went to Cambridge and did very well there, became a minister. I mean, he would have struggled financially, but he managed, worked really hard, had a few parishes down south, and then moved up to Yorkshire, where he settled. This seemed to be his goal. So he seemed to be somebody who was really quite ambitious, not so much in a worldly way, but he wanted to get experience, he wanted to make a difference. Now, it's quite interesting, being a Church of England minister, you had to have gone to, I think, Oxford, Cambridge, if you're an English minister. You were part of the establishment, you were a respectable person, but he never had any money. He had a strong Irish accent, and that would always have set him apart a little bit. Some people would have been quite prejudiced about his Irishness. So he didn't have an easy time of it, I don't think. Moved up to Yorkshire, he met his wife to be Maria. I don't have a picture of Maria to show you, but she was not such an influential part of the children's life with the family they had together, because unfortunately she died when they were young. She was from a more middle-class family in Cornwall. She was staying with family in Yorkshire. They seemed to genuinely fall in love. They married, had 6 children very close together. So originally there were 6: Maria, Elizabeth, Charlotte, Branwell, Emily, and Anne. They moved to Haworth, to the parsonage, as you saw the image earlier, in 1820. And tragically, Maria died shortly afterwards, about 18 months afterwards, actually. She seemed to be the sort of mother that everybody liked her. She was a very warm, intelligent, reassuring kind of presence. So a massive loss. The father now is the big influence in their life. He was quite an unconventional character, very strong-minded, a bit eccentric, and he didn't have a particularly conventional approach to looking after his children. So, for example, he let the girls read quite widely. He thought his daughters, who he must have realised were extremely intelligent, had the right to an education too. But of course, the prospects of a girl in those days would be very, very different to a boy. Branwell, if he was bright and hardworking, the only boy could make his own way in the world. A girl couldn't. Not really. Your best hope was that you'd make a good marriage. Him having no money and them having a fairly lowly position, really, on the social scale, might make that more difficult. So the only way they could earn their own living and be respectable was to be a governess. So a governess would live with a rich family and teach the girls, or possibly a teacher in a kind of respectable private establishment. So he made the worst decision of his life, and he decided to send his daughters away to school. So this is a picture of the school. It was called the Cowanbridge School for the Daughters of Impoverished Clergymen. So this is it's an illustration, an engraving, And it just shows a fairly nondescript building, but bit bigger than the parsonage, but not huge. But it, it doesn't tell you very much really. But it was somewhere near the Lake District. It was 40 miles away from here. It was a charity school. Half the fees were paid for poor clergymen, so daughters. So we sent Mariah and Elizabeth, and then Charlotte and Emily. Now, all schools were strict at this time, but this school seemed particularly awful. If any of you have read Jane Eyre, you might remember Jane is sent to a school called Lowood. I'm just going to show you a couple of images here. I'll explain these in a minute. Well, on the right, we've got, it's a still from a film, lots of little girls all in very kind of strict uniforms, dark dresses, white bonnets, collars, and there's a little girl at the front with a sign that says liar around her neck. On the left, we've got a kind of a woodcut. It's an illustration from Jane Eyre. And there's a little girl on a stool, and there's a daunting, imposing figure of a man at the side, dwarfing her in his side. It's quite a, yeah, it's not a very friendly kind of image if you think of this as being a children's school. So these are both from adaptations of Jane, well, one's from a novel, one's from a film of Jane Eyre. The school Lowood in Jane Eyre is almost entirely based on Cambridge. There's a little girl called Helen Burns who befriends Jane, who is based on Charlotte's eldest sister Mariah. Both girls are bullied at the school by a teacher in particular. Both get consumption, both die. In fact, Charlotte's two eldest sisters, Mariah and Elizabeth, both died of tuberculosis that they caught at school. Everything at the school was done in the name of religion, but it's incredibly unfeeling. There's no compassion towards children. There's an idea that children are born sinful. You have to punish the body to save the soul. Girls in particular need to learn very strict kind of self-denial. So it was just an awful, cheerless place for a child to be. Charlotte was angry about this school for the rest of her life. She thought it was incredibly hypocritical that children were treated like this in the name of Christianity. She blamed it on the death of her sisters. In Jane Eyre, she really taps into that. She minds that experience and writes this really vivid, really heartfelt, angry account of what happened, all from the point of view of Jane Eyre. So a terrible experience, but it had as an artist, Charlotte was able to use it and produce some amazing writing. Patrick brought Charlotte and Emily home, and for the next few years he taught them himself. So he's got 4 children now: Charlotte, Bramwell, Emily, and Anne. We don't know exactly what he taught them. It seems to be kind of what he felt like when he got the time. Their aunt was living with them, so she was quite involved in things like the sewing for the girls and etc. When Charlotte went back to school later, one of the teachers said, oh no, a friend of hers said, she knows more than the teachers about art and literature, but she knows nothing about grammar or geography. So clearly it was a bit of a kind of hit and miss education. But I feel like, it was what they needed to be the writers that they became. I just want to show you a picture here that Emily painted of a dog they had in the house called Keeper. So I said before they were all quite talented artists. So quite a lot of time was given to their art. Emily liked to paint from nature, not literally nature always, in other words, from what she could see rather than copying. Girls were usually taught to paint by copying. They were thought to be not as original as boys. But Emily loved animals, she loved nature, and she would often copy directly. So you can see, I think that shows real talent. Branwell had his own art tutor, which the girls didn't have, but it was something that was considered, it was something that they all were able to give time to. Just going to show you something here. This isn't the best example of Charlotte's art, but it's quite interesting. This was a letter that she sent to a friend, Ellen Nussey. She was a student for a while in Brussels with her sister Emily. And at the bottom of the letter, you can see a little kind of cartoon sketch. On the right is a girl that's quite elegant, dressed in the fashion of the time, with her hair in ringlets, holding hands with a young man with a top hat. Charlotte's teasing her friend Ellen there that she's, she's going to get engaged to this chap. There's a body of water and a boat in between, and on the left is a really odd, stunted drawing of Charlotte herself. Charlotte was probably about 4'9". She was incredibly short. Charlotte's biographer, Elizabeth Gaskell, blamed being so short on the terrible time she had at school and the awful food. But anyway, whatever the reason, she was very short. She wasn't considered attractive, which is something that bothered her. But you can see there, it's quite a clever little caricature. She's having a laugh at her own expense, but it is something that we know that kind of bothered her. But anyway, a little example of Charlotte's artwork. It's interesting to think about what they were reading. Any writer is obviously influenced by other writers, and as I said before, there wasn't much for children to read. Tales of the Arabian Nights was the most kind of childlike thing that they were able to have access to. When they got a bit older, they read the Romantic poets. Massive influence, and particularly this guy. So this is Lord Byron, who is actually described by one of his many cast-off lovers as being mad, bad, and dangerous to know. What an epitaph. So he was quite a guy. He was a bit wild. He had all kinds of affairs with women and men, but all this wasn't known at the time. But he was a great Romantic poet. He created the idea of something we call a Byronic hero. So you might have heard of the Byronic or anti-hero. You still see him in films and in culture today. He's a kind of mysterious one. He's a bit of an outcast. There's something dangerous about him. You don't quite know what's at the back of him. He kind of goes his own way. He's a bit of a law unto himself. He's always dark. You never have a fair-haired Byronic hero. Shadowy, passionate, tortured in some way. Heathcliff in Wuthering Heights is a brilliant example, as is Mr. Rochester in Jane Eyre. If Patrick hadn't allowed his daughters to read Byron, I think they still would have become writers. But if they hadn't kind of imbibed this idea of this kind of sexy, dark hero at the time they did, that impressionable age, they might not have created Heathcliff and Rochester. So I think we've got a lot to thank Mr. Brontë for in letting his daughters read Byron. So they were reading the Romantic poets and immersing themselves in all this kind of passion and so on. Just want to show you, perhaps a little bit before this, is when a really early example of the Bronte's writing. So I talked before about the toy soldiers and the idea that each of the children having an island and how it all began in those childish ways. In the bottom right-hand corner is a map that's owned by the British Library. We'd love to have it, but we don't. And it looks like it's a proper map of a proper place. It's got roads and rivers. You can see the outline of a coast and a couple of islands. And there are colour boundaries that show different little parts. And you can't really see it very well, but on the left, one says Wellington's Land. We've got Sneaky's Land, Monkey's Island, and so on. So this is a map, completely imaginary, that Branwell drew of a place where the toy soldiers were washed up after a storm, and magically they kind of create a colony here. They're fighting local tribes and doing all sorts. So it's all childish fantasy, it's all excitement, adventure. Charlotte starts to write a series of little books for the toy soldiers to read. I don't know if you've heard of the Bronte Juvenilia, they're famous little books, but they're incredibly small. They're about 2 inches high, the shortest, the smallest writing you've ever seen in your life. And they are absolutely extraordinary. So the little one that you can see there, Charlotte's 14. She's just making a kind of parody of magazines that they read, all different kinds of genres and stories, having fun. It was all about that. It was collaborative. It was competitive. It was fantasy. It was just them enjoying themselves. But now, you know, they were incredibly prolific. So it was a great way for them to learn to be writers. We don't have any of Emily's and Anne's. We think they got fed up being overshadowed by Charlotte and Bramwell, who worked together. And Charlotte and Bramwell, they all together created a world called Great Glass Town. Then Charlotte and Bramwell created when they got a bit older, a very sophisticated, glamorous place called Angria. And Emily and Anne created Gondal, which was a wilder, stranger place altogether. None of Emily's and Anne's juvenilia has survived, but lots and lots of Charlotte's have. And we're still slowly bringing them back into the collection. The last little book that we acquired was part of this Honours Field collection, and that was last year. So we're always still getting manuscripts, artifacts that come back to the collection. So there'll be these are out in collections all over the world. There'll be some out there that we don't even know still exists. It'd be nice to think we'll all get them back one day, but they are, you know, quite scattered. We've got the biggest collection in the world, so they are extraordinary. I think we paid £600,000 for the last little book that we bought individually, and these were made on scraps of paper. They just cut little bits out. Paper was expensive. They cut little bits out of books and things, and make their own little books, cover them in wallpaper and so on. Right, I'm going to speed up a little bit now. I've talked quite a lot about the childhood, but I do think that's very important. But so this was a happy time in the life, creative and so on, but the time came when you had to go back out in the world. Charlotte went to a school where she actually had quite a happy experience. They kept her on as a teacher afterwards, and she realised she hated teaching. So this was a bit of a problem because there wasn't much else she could do. I'm going to show the next image. She's got lots after teaching at Roe Head, where she'd been a happy student, but a very unhappy teacher. I mean, you know, not everybody. Teaching is a difficult job, and imagine the dismay you must feel if you realise this is the only career that's open to me. I'm not very good at it. I'm not confident enough. It's just not, I don't have that connection with the students. I find it very dull. So, but, you know, not much hope of anything else. Was she always thinking about maybe writing one day? Probably. She went on from teaching to working as a governess at Stone Gap. This is an image a little bit after Jane Eyre, but probably influenced by it, where you see this long suffering, very dignified. The painting shows a family of very elaborately dressed, boiled-looking children and a very grumpy mother in quite an elaborate domestic setting. And there's the girl, the governess, is there, very kind of self-possessed, dignified. She looks very quiet. She's wearing plain clothes. You imagine she's not being treated very well. Being a governess, I used to think it sounded quite a nice, easy job. You live with a rich family, you look after the girls, but you were socially isolated. You weren't given the power to discipline the children. Incredible amounts was expected of you. Jane Eyre has a much nicer time as a governess, actually, than governesses did in real life. So none of them enjoy teaching. They miss each other. They have to live where they're working. Emily had a disastrous experience teaching at a school in Halifax. That was her only job. Anne actually made it work. She was a governess for 5 years. Her first book, Agnes Grey, is a more realistic picture of life as a governess than Jane Eyre, though it wasn't such a good book, it has to be said. But so Anne made it work. She was away for a few years, but none of them liked it. They all found it difficult. They missed each other. They missed the time to be creative. There was a time when they were all at home together. Charlotte eventually persuaded Emily and Anne that why don't we get our best poetry together? Because it was very much about poetry that they were writing at this time. Why don't we get our best work together and see if we can, make some money out of it? If we can, we'll be independent. We don't have to go away and teach. Emily was having none of it. She absolutely did not want to get published, but eventually, somehow, Charlotte persuaded her. But Emily said, if we get published, we have got to be anonymous. Nobody must know who we are. So I don't know if you know about the famous Pseudonyms that the Brontes chose. So you can see here, poems by Currer, Ellis and Acton Bell. So Charlotte was always a driving force. She got the poem together. She sent them off to a publisher. They had to pay. The Bramwell had left them some money, so they put £40 all together into it, which was quite a lot then. And they publish under these strange names. So you can see they've kept their initials. They've kept the fact they're related. Charlotte becomes Currer, Emily Ellis, and Acton Bell. So the reason is often given that they had to kind of pretend they were men. Women could get published, but it was harder. People will be very prejudiced about you as a woman writer. And they didn't want that. They wanted to be treated on their own merits. So it was Emily's insistence on anonymity, but also this idea that, you know, they didn't want to be seen as women writers. They will be judged very differently. They only sold 2 copies, despite getting very good reviews, particularly Emily. One of the people who bought 1 copy loved it so much, he wrote to the publisher. Now, nobody outside the 3 of them knew who they were. The publisher didn't know, Charlotte's best friend didn't know, Bramwell didn't know, nobody knew. So publisher wrote to the Bell brothers saying, somebody wants your autograph, so here you go. That is the only time you see the pseudonyms written in the Bronte's hand. I'll just say now, while I think this is a question that people often ask me, when did people know that the Bronte work that was actually written by it was written by the Bronte sisters? And it was definitely after Emily's and Anne's death. And even in Charlotte's lifetime and for quite a long while afterwards, the books were still published under the pseudonyms, even though by that time most people knew who they were. So the books, the poetry didn't make a profit, but the next move was a novel. So here we go. Agnes Grey, Wuthering Heights. Oh, 2 volumes of Wuthering Heights there. Charlotte was again, right, let's get the novels finished. Maybe novels will be better. Maybe that'll be more commercially viable. So they sent off Wuthering Heights, Agnes Grey, and Charlotte's first book, The Professor. Agnes Grey and Wuthering Heights were accepted quite early on. Charlotte's book was rejected, which must have been mortifying for her. But one publisher wrote to her and said, right, we're not going to publish this, but you have got talent. Send us something else. Make it more exciting. She'd started writing Jane Eyre. She sent Jane Eyre off, and it was accepted straight away. And Jane Eyre was published first, and it became an overnight sensation. Everyone's talking about it. Not everybody likes it. To be fair, most people did, I think. Queen Victoria famously was reading it. She couldn't put it down. She was reading all through the night. The consensus seemed to be you can't stop reading it, and when you finished it, you can't stop thinking about it. Some people thought it was rather shocking in the passion between Rochester and Jane Eyre, and also how angry the little girl Jane Eyre is. Not everybody liked that at all, and a general independence, but it was very successful. This is actually a page of the manuscript. On the left is the page of the manuscript of Jane Eyre. This is in the British Library. Again, we don't own this, but it's interesting seeing the little crossings out. So that's actually the manuscript in Charlotte's hand. You realise when you're so used to using a computer how difficult it would be to actually have to write a handwritten manuscript, because if you make too many mistakes on one page, you've got to start again. We're used to being able to just change really quickly, so much more time consuming. On the right, you've got Charlotte's second book, Shirley. Again, there's by Currer Bell, author of Jane Eyre. It was with Shirley actually that many people started to realise who Currer Bell might be, because it's set very locally. So just moving on quite quickly, it's so tragic. It's only months after the books were published that Bramwell died first of all. He died in October of 1848, to age 31, probably of TB made worse by his drinking. Emily died 2 months later of TB, and 5 months later Anne died of TB. So just unimaginably awful part of the Bronte story. Charlotte probably thought, apart from the terrible grief she felt, that she was going to get it too, but she never did. So, I mean, the grief and the depression I think Charlotte felt after this must have been awful. She was quite prone to depression and anxiety. But she carried on. She wrote Shirley, she wrote Villette, she did a little bit of travelling. She eventually married her father's curate, Arthur Bell Nichols. Here he is, probably where they got the Bell name from. Upstanding Victorian chap. Maybe not a massive passion, but she was fond of him. He certainly seemed to love her, and she seemed happy. So this is when she was 37. She was living at home with her father still. She never left. Arthur moved in, so the three of them together. 4 months into the marriage, Charlotte became pregnant, and 4 months later, she died of morning sickness. So, she managed to avoid the TB, but she dies of something that today, severe morning sickness, can be treated. It couldn't in those days. So Charlotte dies. Patrick has lost his entire family, Mr. Brontë. He lived until he's 84. He was extremely proud of Charlotte's success, really proud. We don't know what he thought about Wuthering Heights, but I think he'd have liked that too. And Cora Bell had become famous. And Mr. Brontë asked a friend of Charlotte's, Elizabeth Gaskell, to write something about her life. And she did. Because accounts started to appear in newspapers that really made her life seem incredibly dark, a terrible childhood, worse, much worse than it really was. So Gaskell wrote The Life of Charlotte Brontë. This is a picture that she drew, and she's really romanticising it. What Patrick didn't know when he asked Gaskell to write something about Charlotte was she was the source of a lot of these stories. So she creates a picture of Charlotte's life as being, the father was well-meaning, but really almost mentally unhinged. They weren't fed properly. They had a really bleak childhood. None of that we think is true. But what she's trying to do is to make people, as she saw it, understand why the Brontes wrote the way they did. A bit dark, a bit morbid, a bit too passionate. She's trying to make people feel sorry for them, basically, which they would have hated, but it kind of worked. So this awful, the idea that the criticism that was fired at all the Brontes' writing, really, though mainly Wuthering Heights, it abated. People started to see them as very tragic figures. More and more people started to visit Haworth. And really the Brontë kind of tourism thing, if you like, started. Even when Patrick was still alive, there'd be people visiting the house. Oh, can you show me where Emily and Charlotte wrote their great novels and so on. So they just became more and more famous. By the end of the 19th century, I mean, the books were being published finally in their real names, and people got Wuthering Heights, and Emily became really celebrated. The Brontë Society was formed. There was a little museum in the village, but it actually came to the parsonage. So in this picture, sorry, I describe it, it's a little drawing where you can see images we've looked at before: the church, the graveyard, the parsonage, but it almost to me looks like a kind of little medieval French village with the Highlands of Scotland in the background, and so she's, like I say, she's romanticized it, but also made it look more just older and more remote, and that was all part of her story. So people, they had this very romantic idea about the Brontes and their childhood and how awful it was and so on. So the museum opened at the parsonage finally. It was bought by a benefactor and given to the society. So the collection that was growing all the time could be housed in the home of the Brontes themselves, where of course it is now, and that was 1928. So in a few years we'll have the centenary of that. So there'll be all manner of celebrations. I think one of the Brontes have always stayed really, really popular. I think part of the reason for this, it's the nature of the writing, but also the number of films that have been made. Though there's always an adaptation coming out. There's always a new Jane Eyre, a new Wuthering Heights. It seems people want to keep revisiting it and telling the story in a different way. And this has always been the case. I'm just going to show you a couple of examples here. I don't know if anybody has seen the original. Well, it's not the original. There were several versions made before this, but the most famous, the first big Hollywood production with Orson Welles, and I think that's Olivia de Havilland. And it's quite interesting that in the earlier versions, well, I really actually like this. It's very atmospheric, though not that close to the story. I think this was made in the 1940s, I think. Um, the early ones, Jane Eyre seems rather meek, not the quite strong, sometimes fiery character that she's in the book and that you get in later versions. This was a TV one from 2005 with Toby Stevens, Great Rochester, and Ruth Wilson. So here you see a much more determined looking Jane Eyre. You wouldn't necessarily mess with her. She knows her own mind. So she's becoming more like the Jane Eyre in the book, really. And there she is, as I say, with Rochester. There's been another film version since that was from 2005 with Michael Fassbender later on, the film one, a few years ago. That's a really good production. Just going to show you the very first Wuthering Heights. So it's black and white. Obviously, it's a silent film. The film doesn't exist anymore. Maybe it does, but we don't know where it is, and we just got stills from it. So the passionate scene when Kathy's dying and Heathcliff is with her. He's not my idea of Heathcliff, it has to be said, but there you go. That was the first. That was actually filmed around here. We'd love to find that one again. And this is the one that really kind of put it on the map with Laurence Olivier as Heathcliff. This was Wuthering Heights from 1939. Describe this. What this is, it's a scene made out of textiles, mostly knitting, and it's a bed, a four-poster bed. There's a man inside it. There's a woman on the left made out of knitting, holding a knitted jug with water coming out of it. On the right is another figure, a woman with crazy black hair. This is a famous scene from Jane Eyre, where Bertha Mason, although we don't know it's her at the time, sets fire to Rochester's bed and Jane saves him. And this is done in the medium of knitting. And this just gives you an idea of the weird and strange and amazing ways that the Bronte's writing, inspires artists. We work with a lot of contemporary artists, and they come up with just amazing stuff, from their own response to the work. But that's one that I just particularly wanted to share with you. So I'm not even quite sure what I've gone over there. I hope I've not gone on too long. Has anybody got any questions for me now? I'd be very happy to answer any questions.
Claire?
Thank you very much. That was very, very interesting.
Thank you.
Can I ask, did they ever have any pets?
Oh, they did actually. They had a lot of pets. The picture that I showed you earlier, the watercolour, that was of a dog called Keeper. And we think he was an English Mastiff. I don't know if you've ever seen an English Mastiff, but it's absolutely huge. There's quite a lot of stories from Gaskell's biography of this dog getting into terrible fights in the village. People were scared of him, but he adored Emily, and he was kind of putty in her hands. And when she died, he led the funeral procession into church. But they had other dogs. Emily looked after a falcon that somebody brought with a broken wing. They kept geese. They had a cat. Yeah, they always had dogs, and usually other pets as well. Yeah. Anybody got any other questions about anything at all?
Are they all buried at Haworth?
They are all buried at Haworth except for Anne. So when Anne was very ill with tuberculosis, Charlotte and a friend Ellen took her to Scarborough because there was an idea that the sea air might cure you, and it was a place that Anne loved. But she was really too far gone, and she actually died at Scarborough. So she's buried there. She has a headstone. The rest of the family are actually buried underneath the church in Haworth. Because the father was a vicar, that was a kind of privilege that went with the job. You're buried actually beneath the church. So they've got no headstones. the rest of the family in the churchyard. There's a plaque in the church that says shows you where the vault was that they're buried. I
Thank
think it's a shame they're not all buried together.
Yes. Anyone else got any questions before we finish? Graham?
Now unmuted.
Yeah.
Brontë.
I've got a question.
Oh, okay. Jane and then Graham.
How much does it cost to keep the museum going?
Oh,
How
do
do
you
you obtain
know?
the funding?
I don't know. I mean, we don't get funding from the local council. We're an independent charity.
Mm.
At the moment, we're what's called an arts council portfolio organisation, and that means we get regular funding, quite generous funding from the Arts Council. But that's not ongoing forever. We've got that at the moment. We get various grants, but mostly it's people coming through the door, and other fundraising that we do and legacies. But really, mostly it's visitors. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jane. Graham, did you have a question?
I did, but it surrounded funding as well, which has just been covered. So that's fine. Thank you.
Okay.
No problem. I think that's it, Sue. Thank you very
Okay.
much for your talk. Really, really interesting.
You're welcome. I'm sorry it
interesting.
did go on for quite a long time.
Oh, that's okay.
But yeah, well, thank you all for listening.
Thank you very much.
You're
Thank
welcome.
you.
You.